interesting mind, perhaps. But the idea was that was to question how much of the person persists in the absence of their ability to move, etc. Could there be love? Could there be these other affections? Anyway, a rather extreme example, but one that still haunts me, and I suppose I'm thinking about still now. Yeah.
Also, just to follow that point, there's a lot about us that we don't have access to unless we enact it physically. Like, if I ask you, do you still know how to ride a bike, right? There's no place in your memory where you can inspect by just sitting in your chair that you've retained the knowledge of how to ride a bike, right? Like, procedural memory is different from semantic or episodic memory. If I asked you, do you know your address? Yes, you can recall your address just sitting there, but if you had a micro stroke that neatly dissected out your ability to ride a bike, and left everything else intact, you might think you could ride a bike, but suddenly you stand up next to one and you have no idea what to do with it, and that would be a discovery that would only happen if you were motorically engaged with that object. And I'm sure there's we could probably come up with 100 things about us that really seem core to us, and not separable for our from our personhood, which seem to only get invoked when we're out there moving in the world, and we have limbs, etc. But yeah, no, it's the seat of consciousness. I mean, the right framework to talk about all of this, from my point of view, is consciousness and its contents, right? So we have consciousness, the fact that there's something that is like to be us, right? The fact that the world and our internal experience is illuminated, that it has a qualitative character. And then there's the question of what is that qualitative character? What is it? What kinds of information do we have access to? What does it feel like to be us? How do different states of arousal change that? So you talked about fear. Yeah, I mean, fear can change a lot of things, but and various neurological deficits, or you can add drugs to the mix. You add psychedelics that radically transform the contents of consciousness. From my point of view, consciousness itself is simply the cognizance, the awareness that is the floodlights by which any of that stuff appears, right? So consciousness doesn't change, but its contents change. And to come back to meditation for a second, many people think meditation is about changing the contents of consciousness. There's some contents you want to get rid of, like anxiety. Other contents you want to encourage, like calm and unconditional love, or some other classically pleasant pro-social emotion. And that's all fine. That's all possible. But the real wisdom of the 2,000-year-old wisdom of meditation, that really is the chewy center of the Tootsie Pop, is a recognition of what consciousness itself is always already like, regardless of the contents and the changes in contents. And this is why, we might talk about this, but this is why they're mutually compatible. Psychedelics and meditation for me are somewhat orthogonal, because psychedelics is all about making wholesale changes to the contents of consciousness, and there's some wonderful consequences of doing that. There can be some harrowing and terrifying consequences of doing that, but generally speaking, I think used wisely, they can be incredibly valuable, and the therapeutic potential there is enormous. But the crucial disjunction here is that there really is something to recognize about ordinary waking consciousness, that the consciousness that's compatible with my driving a car to get here on time, right? You don't have to have the pyrotechnics of being on LSD to see to transcend the central illusion that I'm saying is the thing to be transcended, which is the sense that there's a duality between subject and object in every moment of experience. And to take it back to something you said about just all of our different modes in ordinary life, the interesting thing is I think people are constantly losing their sense of self, and they're not aware of it. And there's probably an analogy to the visual system here, which is visual saccades, which perhaps you've spoken about at some point on your podcast.
Not enough, so please.
Yeah. So what happens with our, every time we move our eyes, this is called a saccade, and we do that about 3 times a second or so, just normally. There is the region of motor cortex that affects that movement sends what's called an efferent copy of that motor movement, which is used as information that propagates back to visual cortex that suppresses the data of vision while the eyes are moving, because otherwise, if you weren't doing that, every time you moved your eyes, it would seem like the visual scene itself was lurching around. And people can experience this for themselves if they just, touch one of their eyeballs on the side, not all that hard, and kind of jiggle it, and then you can roll it around, you can jiggle it from side to side. You can see that a movement of the eyeball that's not governed by your ocular motor system delivers a jiggling of the world, because it's not, your brain is not anticipating it in the same way, and you're not producing that same predictive copy of the movement.
It's a little bit like there's some action sports filmers on our staff here, the gimbal, that holds an iPhone, like you see the kids on surfboards or skateboards or something. They hold a phone while moving around, or the people who are the vloggers. They don't even still use that phrase. Moving around, and it's image stabilization essentially. Right. That keeps the camera steady, and these are more than cameras, of course. For those listening, I'm pointing at my eyes, but they do far more than just what a camera would do. But yeah, this internal system of image stabilization. Yeah, I could see perhaps where you're going with this. That it allows us to remain in a self-referencing scheme, as opposed to sort of paying attention to just how confusing it is to track the visual world at some level.
Well, actually, where I'm going is that so people are having this suppression of vision 3 times a second on average, and they're not experiencing it, right? So you're literally you're effectively going blind, and you're not noticing it, and
this is very fast.
Yes, it's very fast. Now, there's an analogous suppression, I would say, of the sense of self that occurs every time attention gets absorbed significantly in its object, right? So we even have this concept of losing yourself in your work, or you losing the classic flow experiences have this quality where there's and this tends to be why they're so rewarding, where there's just, if you're in some athletic activity, or an aesthetic one, or you could be having sex, or whatever it is, some peak experience, its peakness usually entails there being some brief period where there was no distance between you and the experience, right? For that moment, you were no longer looking over your own shoulder, or anticipating the next moment, or trying to get somewhere where you weren't, or micromanaging errors, or there's just the flow of unity with whatever the experience is. A surfer on the wave, right? And we love those experiences, and then we are continually abstracted away from them by our thinking about them. We will think, oh my God, that was so good, or how do I get back to that? Or you're looking at a sunset, it's the most beautiful sunset you've ever seen, and then you're continually interrupting the experience of merely seeing it with a commentary about how amazing this is, and I wonder, what are real estate prices here? I mean, is it possible that we could move here? And your mind is just continually narrating a conversation you're having with yourself, however paradoxically. I mean, you're telling yourself things that you already know, as though there were 2 of you rather often, right? You're just, I'm looking for, which is the water, and so there it is, right? But I'm the one seeing it. Who am I saying, oh, there it is too, as though there's someone else who needs to be informed about the thing I already saw, right? So it's there's something about our internal dialogue that is paradoxical.
Is there any neurologic condition, collocolectomy or anything like that, where somehow people feel more unified with the self on a continual basis? The observer and the actor. within, whether it stay more as a complete sentence. Is there any known neurological syndrome? It makes it sound like a bad thing, but it could be a good thing, whereby people feel that the actor and the observer within them are unified continually.
There's not a pathological one. Some of the work on the default mode network suggests that that's at least part of the story, right? So the default mode network, which has been talked about a lot of late because it has come up both in the meditation literature and in the psychedelic literature. But its original discovery was that, and the reason why it was called the default mode was that in virtually every neuroimaging experiment ever run, they found that between tasks, when the brain was just in its default state, these midline structures would increase their activity, and then they would reliably diminish whenever the person in the scanner was on task, and usually that meant some kind of outward-looking, visual discrimination task. I mean, but it could be visual, it could be semantic, it could be, but it tends to be their eyes are open and they're paying attention to something that's being broadcast to them through, monitor goggles, or they're looking at a mirror that's showing them a computer monitor. But the general insight was there are these midline structures in the brain that seem to be increasing their activity when the brain is just kind of idling between tasks, waiting for something to happen. And then further experiments found tasks that actually upregulated activity there, beyond baseline. And those tasks seem to be self-referential, so that when you ask people, you give